Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our main keynote session for today. Just as everyone's connecting and getting back online, I just want to introduce our keynote for this evening, Dr. Simon Adams, Executive Director of the Global Centre for the Responsibility to Protect. I just want to say a little bit about Simon and the Global Centre. The Global Centre was established in 2008. I hope that's correct. I've done my research, and has become, I think, without doubt, the leading organisation for advancing and discussing the responsibility to protect. The Global Centre has three main areas of focus. Clarifying the responsibility to protect, according to the Global Centre, this is in-depth research and analysis for policymakers, focusing on real-world case studies and lessons learned. The Global Centre is the leading international authority on applying R2P lens to crisis situations. The second main area, the Global Centre says, is to advocate for the implementation of the responsibility to protect, influencing decision makers to act and to prevent mass atrocity crimes, and also working closely with governments, regional organisations, the UN Security Council and the United Nations Secretariat, and providing policymakers with advice to help mobilise meaningful action on R2P. And then thirdly, the Global Centre focuses on strengthening and institutionalising the responsibility to protect. And this is building dedicated institutions and capacities at the national, regional and international level to effectively respond to the threat of mass atrocity crimes. So Dr. Adams has recently published with Routledge Mass Atrocities, the Responsibility to Protect and the Future of Human Rights, If Not Now, When? And this book seeks to set out and explain all of the major situations where mass atrocities have occurred or been prevented over the 15 years since the Responsibility to Protect was adopted at the 2005 World Summit. Today, we've been talking about reflecting on 20 years since we first had the idea of the Responsibility to Protect from the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. His book, looking at 15 years since the world adopted and promised, essentially, that they did have a responsibility to protect. And in this book, Dr. Adams provides a history of human rights, mass atrocities, and the principle of the responsibility to protect from the perspective of someone whose day job, it says, has been to work with the UN Security Council, various governments, and civil society to help ensure that the international community does not fail those who face the threat of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So, to talk to us more today about the responsibility to protect, please welcome Dr. Simon Adams.
Hey, thank you for that, Patrick. And I'm speaking to you here from Lenape-Hoking, the land of the Lenape, better known as Brooklyn, New York, to people around the world these days. And I hope you can hear me okay wherever you are in the world. And I want to start off by thanking the conference organizers, especially Vasilka, who has been an unrelenting champion of this forum for discussion about R2P since she first conceived, organized and convened the very first conference in Ljubljana in 2013. And I also want to thank Patrick and the UK-based organizing committee who have worked so hard to overcome the impediments imposed by the pandemic to make sure that this conference can go ahead. You know, I had a little bit of a walk around the virtual venue earlier today, and it was quite an experience. There are so many interesting topics that are being discussed at this conference, and it's to my genuine regret that due to work obligations, I can't attend all of them. But I'm fascinated that there's a panel on China and R2P, papers on Uniting for Peace mechanism of the UN General Assembly, on R2P and the OAS, on the EU and AU, on refugees, on applying the R2P lens to LGBT plus persecution, which I personally think is a somewhat neglected area, on peacekeeping operations and civilian protection, on international justice, on so on and so forth, on R2P in theory and practice from a wide range of perspectives. And I hope that in the future, other scholars will take up related issues of emerging importance to practitioners, such as the connection between atrocities and the protection of cultural heritage, or about how the existential challenge of climate change is affecting identity-based conflicts in different parts of the world. And I also note that this conference is dedicated to the memory of Professor Edward Luck, the first UN Special Advisor on R2P, and someone I had the pleasure of working with for almost a decade. And I was struggling to find a departure point for this keynote. And so let me engage the initial sequence by saying something about Ed and about his legacy. Because as a person, Ed was immeasurably kind, with a bone-dry wit. Ed and I appeared on platforms together all around the world, and no matter what the topic was, I can honestly say I always learned something from him. And Ed was a giant in our field, and so I want to mention 3 lasting influences he had on the development of R2P. The first is obvious. Ed was the principal author of the UN Secretary General's 2009 report on R2P, which put forward the 3-pillar approach for the very first time. And in 2005, when the assembled heads of state and government adopted R2P in paragraphs 138, 139 of the UN World Summit Outcome document, no commas were spared in those 24 lines of prosaic diplomatic prose that promised that the international community would finally take timely and decisive action to prevent and halt war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and genocide. But how? The role of the state, of the UN Security Council, the General Assembly were all mentioned, chapters 6, 7, and 8 of the UN Charter. But it was Ed who actually boiled all that down into a sensible and practical demarcation of labor. So I think it's fair to say the 3-pillar approach kind of permanently shaped our understanding of how to implement R2P. I think Ed's second big contribution was that he emphasized that R2P was not a magical panacea. Australia's former Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, who of course was the co-chair of the international commission that developed R2P, has written that the whole point was, and I quote Gareth, to create a new norm of international behavior which states would feel ashamed to violate, compelled to observe, or at least embarrassed to ignore. Or as Ed himself put it in 2015, and again I quote from him, he said, "Some norms do little more than codify existing patterns of behavior, while R2P, like other human rights and humanitarian rights, has an aspirational quality in that it challenges governments, groups, and individuals to do better and aim higher. Without some level of discomfort and dissatisfaction with current practice, we will never get better at prevention and protection." In other words, R2P raises expectations around what is permissible in the cold, calculating, cruel world of international diplomacy and seeks to change state behavior. And that was never going to be easy. But do better, aim higher. I think Ed's third major contribution was with regard to his work with his partner Dana around the individual responsibility to protect. This was Ed and Dana's attempt to confront the state-centric nature of R2P as it was originally conceptualized and focus on why policymakers act in particular ways. They wrote that, and I quote them, "We need to better understand why some people stand up against incitement and the persecution of minorities and others look the other way. Why some leaders can be dissuaded from taking this path and others seem immune to international pressure. And what can assist those in civil society, parliaments, or government who want to prevent such calamities." I think the individual responsibility to protect underlined the importance of upstanders for human rights in our theory of change. And through his own quiet kindness, I think Ed always reminded me that it was this shared sense of humanity that must guide our work, and I miss him deeply. Because as we look around the world today, we see that 80 million people are now displaced by persecution, conflict, and atrocities. In Gaza, Yemen, or Ethiopia, international humanitarian law is routinely violated. Over 1 million ethnic Uyghurs are in mass detention facilities in China. People are being murdered because of their cultural or ethnic identity in Cameroon and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Armed extremists attack communities in the Sahel, in Mozambique, in Nigeria, in Afghanistan, and state forces, of course, continue to persecute, torture, and disappear dissidents in Syria and Venezuela, despite years of reporting on the scale and the scope of ongoing crimes against humanity in both countries. And regrettably, that is not an exhaustive list. We are living in times when human rights are under threat, and a deeply divided UN Security Council appears incapable of responding in a timely and decisive manner to anything. For example, what more damning indictment could there be of the UN Security Council that at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, it could not even agree to unanimously endorse UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' anodyne call for a global ceasefire. Guterres issued his plea on the 23rd of March as the world was going into lockdown. And over the following 2 months, more than 660,000 people were newly displaced in 19 countries, intensifying the pressure on humanitarian organizations that were struggling to deal with a once-in-a-century pandemic. The 15 members of the UN Security Council, of course, form the most powerful diplomatic body on earth. But it took 100 days, 3.5 months, for the Council to endorse the UN Secretary General's innocuous call for a global ceasefire. Not because they, missed the press release, but because of partisan divisions. This included a completely pointless diplomatic battle between the United States and China over whether there could be a teensy-weensy laudatory mention of the World Health Organization in the text. Or in other words, a body that was established at the end of the Second World War with this monumental ambition to save, to quote from the charter, future generations from the scourge of war, was now so deeply entrenched in its own petty positions that it was incapable of agreeing during a global pandemic to give peace a chance. So I think, we should all remember this battle over peace the next time someone tells us that R2P and mass atrocity prevention is controversial. And given all of the above, and that it's now 16 years since R2P was adopted at the UN World Summit and has definitely entered its awkward teenage phase, I want to focus on one country, Myanmar, and examine how we have failed, how we have succeeded, and how we get out of this mess. Because today also marks 4 months since General Min Aung Hlaing launched a military coup in Myanmar. And since then, over 820 people have been killed by the security forces, 5,000 have been detained. Several prominent pro-democracy activists have been tortured to death, and the country's elected leaders remain in hiding or under arrest. The economy has flatlined, with investors abandoning Myanmar and strikes crippling the public sector. The army, or Tatmadaw, has reignited its conflict with several ethnic armed groups and has recently used airstrikes against civilian populations in outlying provinces. And despite all of this, despite months and months of deadly repression, fresh protests still break out every day in urban neighborhoods, in towns and villages across the country. And that, ubiquitous three-finger salute of the protesters is just one reflection that young people in Myanmar today not only identify with global culture, but have also been inspired by their peers in Hong Kong, Thailand, and elsewhere. As Gen Z continue to lead the resistance to military rule, they are calling on the international community, of course, not to just condemn what is happening in their country, but to act. And for example, on the 5th of March, as the UN Security Council was meeting in New York, people all across Myanmar held protest vigils. And despite a strict nighttime curfew, people came into the streets in Yangon and Mandalay to write things like "We need R2P" and "R2P save Myanmar" in candlelight in the streets and outside Buddhist pagodas. At other protests over the following weeks, thousands more people were photographed. I'm sure everybody at this conference saw this on the internet, carrying placards with R2P messages. In Tamu Town, in the far northwest near the border with India. Lines of people marched with white t-shirts with R2P printed on them. In Parkant in Kachin State, people peacefully protested carrying roses and R2P signs. In Konchen Kone, young protesters used stencils to spray paint, "We need R2P, we want democracy," in the streets. We even got sent at the Global Center, tagged in photos and sent pictures of Easter eggs repainted with R2P messages on them, traditional toy dolls repainted with R2P messages on them. And the fact that all of this was happening in English, a language which is only spoken by about 5% of Myanmar's population, points to the fact that the protesters are pleading their case to a global audience. And this is entirely appropriate because the current crisis in Myanmar has its origins in the past failure of the international community to hold the Tatmadaw responsible for their crimes, particularly for the genocide against the Rohingya. In August of 2017, 2 of Myanmar's light infantry divisions launched so-called clearance operations against the ethnic Rohingya population of Rakhine State in the northwest of the country. And over the following 4 months, the security forces burned down over 400 villages and an estimated 750,000 Rohingya, 80% of the population, were forced to flee the country. And in the refugee camps in neighboring Bangladesh, Rohingya survivors told stories of mass rape, systematic killings. Many exhibited signs of extreme trauma, as well as of untreated stab and bullet wounds. One credible report calculated the approximate death toll to be around 43,000 Rohingya adults who had died inside the country. Meanwhile, the authorities in Myanmar began bulldozing the remains of many burned and abandoned Rohingya villages. Along with my colleagues from Human Rights Watch and Fortify Rights, I actually briefed members of the UN Security Council on the morning of the 8th of September 2017. That was less than 2 weeks after the genocide commenced. And of the diplomats who were assembled around the table that morning, not one voiced any doubts regarding the veracity of the evidence we presented. And not one of them challenged the idea that atrocities were underway in Rakhine State. And not one of the diplomats appeared to believe that they were capable of doing anything to stop it. Privately, they would complain about China's intransigence. Beijing, they told us, had repeatedly threatened to veto any draft UN Security Council resolution seeking to impose sanctions on Myanmar's generals. As a result, it took 10 weeks for the Security Council to release just a tepid presidential statement on the crisis. And they were not alone in their tardiness, I think it has to be said as well. Undeterred by years of warnings about the threat of atrocities, a number of governments had taken refuge in the idea that quiet diplomacy, including acquiescing, in this case, to Myanmar's insistence on not publicly mentioning the Rohingya, that this quiet diplomacy would enable gentle reform in Myanmar. And instead, it had the reverse effect. It encouraged the most extreme elements in the military and empowered those generals who desired a final solution in Rakhine State. It was due to the brave testimony, though, of Rohingya survivors, as well as the efforts of journalists, humanitarian workers, and civil society activists, that there was sustained outrage regarding the genocide, and partly in response to kind of incessant campaigning. During 2018, the United States, the European Union, and Canada imposed targeted sanctions on some members of Myanmar's security forces. But these measures were not mandated by the UN Security Council and were therefore not binding under international law. And as of today, the 1st of June, 2021, almost 4 years since the genocide, there has still not been a single council resolution adopted to name the nature of the crime committed against the Rohingya or to hold the perpetrators accountable. And that could have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. Because in the same way that metastasizing conflicts and atrocities weaken international norms, justice can be contagious. action can be contagious. And even in the most desperate cases with the Security Council sort of immobilized and inert, states in the UN system can still find innovative ways of upholding their responsibility to protect. For example, on the 27th of August 2018, 1 year after the clearance operations began, the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar, the FFM, reported on atrocities committed against the Rohingya. And their devastating 400-page report found evidence of genocidal intent, including discriminatory government policies and a premeditated plan to destroy Rohingya communities. The report called for several top military officers to be prosecuted for genocide, as well as for crimes against humanity and war crimes committed also in Kachin and Shan states. And during October of that year, the FFM's chair, Marzuki Durisman, was invited to brief the UN Security Council. And although China and Russia tried to block him from speaking, a majority of the council voted in favor of the briefing, at which Durisman emphasized, and I quote, "National sovereignty is not a license to commit crimes against humanity or genocide. The Rohingya and all of Myanmar's people, in fact, the entire world, is looking at you to take action." But the biggest surprise, I think, for me at least, was yet to come. Because in 2018, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect began quietly working behind the scenes with our partners at the Global Justice Center and at Human Rights Watch on the viability of taking Myanmar to the International Court of Justice for breaching the Genocide Convention. And without getting too much into the legal complexities, let me say that almost any state that was a signatory to the convention could have initiated this case. And we discreetly approached a number of states, I mean, a large number of states, at the highest levels of their foreign ministry to try and get them to do so, including states that loudly proclaim their commitment to international justice and the rule of law. And they all turned us down. Some admitted that they were afraid of Chinese retribution, which could have been a factor. Others just said the case was too politically sensitive, etc., etc. And then one morning in our New York office, Nadira Court, our Myanmar expert, received a Google notification from a newspaper in Bangladesh that mentioned that the Justice Minister of the Gambia, Abubakar Bah Tambadou, had just made some really interesting comments while visiting Rohingya refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, where he spoke about not only the shocking stories that he had heard from survivors, but he also said if the UN Security Council was unprepared to ensure that Myanmar security forces were held accountable for genocide in an international court, then he would. And suffice to say, we immediately made contact with Minister Tambadou. We met several times in New York and in Banjul, and we started working together. And the impetus very much came from Tambadou and the Gambia, but we were honored to play the role of advisors and kind of political co-conspirators in an attempt to hold Myanmar's generals accountable for their crimes. And finally, in late 2019, of course, it was announced that the Gambia would take Myanmar to the International Court of Justice for breaching the Genocide Convention. And the public announcement of this historic case was actually made by Minister Tambadou in an event co-hosted by Bangladesh and the Global Center on the margins of the UN General Assembly. And when that case did commence in The Hague in December 2019, the Gambia immediately submitted a request for the court to issue provisional measures to protect the Rohingya and secure evidence of the crimes committed against them. And on that day, for those of you who watch it, you'll remember Minister Tambadou spoke movingly of the atrocities that had been committed, while State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi from Myanmar came to The Hague to deny that a genocide had taken place and to defend Myanmar's military. Nevertheless, the ICJ issued a favorable provisional measures order in January 2020, and at that time, the case kind of exploded in terms of massive global media attention. A few months later, though, Tambadou was named by Time magazine as one of the most influential people in the world for the year. And in response, this immensely humble man from the smallest country on the African continent, was quoted as saying that international law is not the exclusive preserve of the rich and powerful countries. You do not have to be a military or economic power to stand for justice, to stand for what is right. We are doing this in the name of humanity. In other words, do better, aim higher. And since then, the Netherlands and Canada have decided to intervene in the ICJ case on the side of the Gambia. The Dutch government have also initiated a separate case to try to hold the Syrian government accountable for torture. And the Myanmar case is ongoing, but like I said, justice is contagious. Which brings me all the way back to the coup. Because Myanmar's generals were not impressed by Aung San Suu Kyi's attempts to defend them from the charge of genocide at the ICJ. And instead, after comprehensively losing the November 2020 election, they decided to dispense with civilian-led government. And in response to that February coup, on the 10th of March, the UN Security Council issued a presidential statement that stressed the need for democratic institutions and processes, refrain from violence, respect human rights, etc. But 4 months, I should say, since the military seized power, the Council has still not adopted a single resolution on the coup, let alone imposed any measures that would be binding under international law. By contrast, some individual states have tried to uphold their responsibility to protect in relation to Myanmar. Australia, Canada, the UK, the United States, all of whom imposed sanctions on senior military officials in response to the Rohingya genocide, have expanded these since the coup. The European Union has also imposed sanctions on 11 senior military officers, including General Min Aung Hlaing, and suspended development aid. The US, UK, and EU have also sanctioned the massive military-controlled conglomerates which dominate Myanmar's economy. South Korea has ended defense exchanges. New Zealand has cut all ties, and Norway has also halted development assistance. Crucially, we've also seen things happening in the business side. Woodside Energy, Maersk Shipping, H&M, Benetton, all of these major international corporations have suspended their operations or are divesting from Myanmar. And I've talked about this in the media, but I think the Woodside decision is especially significant as the energy industry provides almost $1 billion a year to Myanmar, revenue that can fund the military's repression. And I think all foreign companies and all governments should also sever ties with military-controlled businesses in Myanmar, because in addition to being this well-known instrument of terror, the Tatmadaw is also a massive economic enterprise that enriches and corrupts its senior members. And so we see in the Myanmar case an example of everything that is wrong with the current period of world history that we are living through. There has been total paralysis at the level of the UN Security Council, and ASEAN has also been feeble and ineffective in responding to the coup. But we have achieved, nevertheless, some success in getting bilateral measures imposed. And while General Min Aung Hlaing is relying on ASEAN's traditional non-interference doctrine to enable him to normalize relations after the blood dries in the streets, we will continue to emphasize that no UN member state should trade with or recognize his illegitimate military regime. I believe, for one, that he belongs in handcuffs in The Hague, and I want to help get him there. Inertia and timidity in the response to the Tatmadaw's past atrocities created a climate of impunity that led to the coup. And it is time to finally hold Myanmar's generals accountable for their crimes. So I do need to end, but before I do so, I want to return to something else that Ed Luck said. In 2015, he wrote that, and I quote, "Like the polarized mix of extravagant praise and merciless scorn that greeted it from the outset, the first decade of the responsibility to protect has been anything but neutral. R2P's successes have been quiet and its failures raw and public." But this did not cause Ed to waver or to tremble. And despite defeats and disappointments, as a mobilizing principle, R2P has gained remarkable political traction in a short period of time. 16 years after it was first adopted, R2P has been invoked in more than 90 UN Security Council resolutions, including authorizing action to halt atrocities in Cote d'Ivoire, in northern Iraq. International political pressure also helped prevent the worst from happening in Kenya and Burundi. Meanwhile, in the DRC and South Sudan or in Central African Republic, blue-helmeted UN peacekeepers have upheld the international community's responsibility to protect civilians from atrocities and have saved lives. But R2P, of course, has also provoked an intense controversy with the 2011 military intervention in Libya and the failure to act with regard to Syria, causing especially bitter divisions. But the international community also completely failed to end atrocities in Sri Lanka and in Yemen. And with the current politics of the UN Security Council having become so toxic, the challenge that now faces us is enormous. All too often, it appears that the international community still prefers kind of solemn, hand-wringing in the aftermath to atrocities, to being accused of acting prematurely to avert them. And that price of failure has been exorbitant. So, for example, Syria's gross domestic product decreased by up to 80% between 2010 and 2016 as a result of atrocities and war, dramatically increasing poverty as the conflict displaced over 12 million people, flattened entire cities, and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. And 4 months since the coup in Myanmar, the bravery and resilience of the civil disobedience movement, combined with ongoing calls for the international community to uphold its responsibility to protect, I think has sent a powerful signal to the rest of the world. Jacqueline Streitfeld Hall, who also works at the Global Center, she wrote on Twitter, and I quote, "For anyone who has ever thought that R2P was just an abstract term reserved for the UN in New York with no practical meaning for the people it's meant to protect, the signs, shirts, etc., emblazoned with R2P in Myanmar this month show otherwise. They know states have a responsibility." I agree, they know. And so how do we meet this challenge? States need to go around the UN Security Council in ways that are inventive, stay within international law, but push the boundaries of the acceptable. We should not passively accept the Council's inaction and dysfunction. We need to shift the locus of action elsewhere, as we did with the Myanmar ICJ case. Later this week, for example, I'll be speaking at an event to launch a new guidance document on the powers of the UN General Assembly to prevent and respond to atrocity crimes. And this document provides lots of examples of how the world's parliament can be utilized by those who desire change in the international system. Just one example, in the 1980s, the Assembly's Credentials Committee continually rejected the diplomats of white South Africa, apartheid South Africa, on the basis that their government's policies violated the UN Charter. And this is something that should be looked at with regard to Myanmar's military regime and other atrocity perpetrators. In the area of international justice and accountability, we see that Germany has been leading the way in terms of arresting Syrian perpetrators and putting them on trial under the principle of universal jurisdiction. In West Africa, we see that the sub-regional organization, ECOWAS, not only has a conflict early warning system, but is sometimes following up those warnings with decisive action, including in the Gambia, by the way, where ECOWAS's intervention led to real and substantial improvements in human rights and governance, and worth mentioning, also enabled Ba Tambadou to become the Justice Minister. There are also more than 60 states from 6 continents, plus the EU and the OAS, who have appointed a senior official as a R2P focal point and are struggling to assist one another in meaningful ways when it comes to preventing atrocities and promoting human rights. And so my final message is to the students and to the civil society activists who are listening to this keynote. In a world of cynicism and lowest common denominator diplomacy, there are all too many people trying to convince you that ideas, norms, and principles don't matter. Don't believe them. Because in Myanmar, Palestine, Cameroon, the Congo, Venezuela, everywhere in the world where there is persecution and conflict, there are also people organizing to end it. And those of us who are lucky enough to be living in societies where we don't have to fear the machete or the concentration camp need to intensify the pressure on our governments to do better and aim higher. Or to quote, one Myanmar protester who wrote to me during the first weeks of the crisis, emailed me and said, "Sir, I know that you are all doing your best, but please keep on pushing. I humbly request. Our lives are at stake." We are not all Minister Tambadou of the Gambia, but we are all capable of small acts of intestinal fortitude and uncommon decency. So let me quote somewhat self-indulgently, and I promise I'll end in a second, Patrick, from a speech that I delivered to members of the UN Security Council on the afternoon of the 10th of December 2018, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the Genocide Convention. I think it remains relevant as we all contemplate the future of R2P over the next decade. I said, and I quote, "Those to whom mass atrocities are not just words, but real acts that pose a direct threat to them, their families, and their communities are looking to this council. Some of you may be shy of the words, but those facing death need you to defend human rights and uphold your responsibility to protect. And they need you to do so without exception and with consistency and courage." That's the end of that quote, but I believe that future generations will eventually view atrocity crimes the way that we view witch burning and chattel slavery, as an antiquated practice from a cruel time. But if the practice of selling a fellow human being seems not just reprehensible, but incomprehensible to people of our century, then we need to acknowledge that the campaign to outlaw slavery did not depend solely upon the benevolence of government, but required years of sweat and tears by ordinary activists who, through their defiance and determination, helped bend the arc of history. We can do the same, and we must do the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adams, for that keynote address. I'm sure we're all clapping behind our muted screens. It's not the same when we're not in person. I'm going to open the floor up to questions now. Now, remember, there are 3 ways in which you can ask questions today. Those of you watching on YouTube, you can post on the live chat there, and we can bring them over. Those of you in GatherTown, you can post within the chat in GatherTown. We already have a couple of questions there that I will put to Simon Adams in a moment. And of course, if you are in the Collaborate session, please raise your hand to indicate that you'd like to come in to make a comment via video or microphone. And then if you have a question without video or microphone, you can post it in the Collaborate chat. So to start us off, I have a question here through GatherTown from Jens Peterson from UNA Sweden, who asks, "Earlier today at the conference, we had a presentation saying that China actually cares about reputational costs. Do you agree? And were the UN Security Council during the genocide unaware of this or just unwilling to suggest something that might offend China?" Thank you for that question. I will add another just now from GatherTown, and then I'll come to you. From Adrian McGeer, he asks, what positives for the responsibility to protect have come out of Myanmar when there has been a total lack of accountability beyond the catchphrase? He asks, is R2P predominantly a call for help rather than an action point? Okay. And I'll take one more question, if that's okay, from the audience in Collaborate. Richard, I will make you a presenter now for you to ask your question.
Cheers, Patrick, and thanks, Simon, for that fantastic talk. So someone who spoke on the powers of the General Assembly and Uniting for Peace earlier, I'm just wondering your opinion, Simon, on whether you think that the UN General Assembly draft resolution condemning the military coup in Myanmar and the call for the arms embargo is likely to go through, and if it does pass, how can it have a positive impact? Thank you.
Okay. In no particular order other than where I scribbled them on the piece of paper I'm looking at. I think it was Aiden. What accountability? I think I spent a good 5+ minutes talking about forms of accountability that I think have been imposed on Myanmar, whether it be the targeted sanctions, the ICJ case. I didn't have a chance to mention there is actually also a preliminary investigation at the ICC as well. And I certainly hope that states around the world will treat the generals like the pariahs that they are, and that it's unsafe for them. I don't imagine General Min Aung Hlaing is planning a holiday to Disneyland over the summer, but I would like for him certainly to be nervous about traveling anywhere outside of Myanmar unless he be arrested under universal jurisdiction. That doesn't mean that's going to happen, but I certainly think there have been attempts, as I mentioned, to hold the regime accountable, and I mentioned those. Richard's question on whether the resolution will go through or not, I think it's really unclear, Richard. There's been some media coverage about this over the weekend. You may or may not have seen, but there's certainly an attempt, I think, unfortunately, including by some ASEAN states, to water down that resolution. I think that would be an enormous mistake, and I think it would send a very negative signal to the generals in Myanmar. But I think there's a broader point that you're kind of raising, and that you know, regarding uniting for peace and so forth, which is that, you know, I just think the UN General Assembly is such an underutilized tool, and you know, nothing's going to be changed overnight. It's not like any of us can just click our fingers and get what we want. But I think there are so many things that the UN General Assembly hasn't tried either in a very long time, or hasn't tried because the politics of it don't suit some people. And that includes, you know, the one example that I mentioned, the Credentials Committee and diplomats from regimes that are perpetrating atrocities. There's other things, including the Uniting for Peace mechanism, that haven't been tried in a very long time as well. So I certainly wish we would see more of that. And then in terms of Jens's question, does China care about reputational costs? I think it does, and I think that, you know, it's an incredibly powerful state, to say the very least. You know, this is a state, most populous country on earth, permanent seat on the Security Council, nuclear weapons, but it does care about reputational costs. And, you know, we've seen glimpses of that in different kinds of ways. And I think there's some that are, you know, the other people have probably talked about in that session on China, which unfortunately I didn't get to go to.
Can I just interrupt you there? I'm very, very sorry, Simon. We're having a little issue here where we're getting a warning that we're going to be kicked out of this session. So what's going to happen is, I think in a moment, this session will shut down. Now that shouldn't happen. We have set this up so it shouldn't happen, but the link will continue to work. So what unfortunately will happen is, for a moment, we will leave the session and then be able to resume, which is very unfortunate, and I'm not sure why this is the case. Let me just check here. Yeah, the link should work again in a moment. So if you don't mind, we will pause there for a very short break, if you don't mind, and then come back again in 5 minutes. And if all participants, if you don't mind, leaving the session and rejoining in 5 minutes, and we'll resume the Q&As then. Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, we are back up and running on the live stream here as well. Thank you for those for bearing with us just for that moment where we had to just reconnect to our session. Right, where were we? Richard is just joining us, and he had a question earlier too. I wonder if, Richard, if you don't mind asking your question again, just so that we can pick up from where we left off there. Let me just make you a presenter. There you go.
I think Simon did actually answer my question.
Oh, sorry, he did.
It was someone else who had their hand up, but I can't remember who it was.
No,
So.
it was Jens Peterson from.
That's correct.
UK,
yeah, Jens
Sweden.
asked you. Yeah. Earlier today, we had a presentation saying that China actually cares about reputational costs. Do you agree with that? And where the Security Council during the genocide unaware of this, or just unwilling to suggest something that might offend China?
Yeah, I think it's difficult with the Chinese. I mean, that's what I was starting to say at the end. You know, a massive country, permanent seat on the Security Council, nuclear weapons, not adverse to punishing its adversaries in whatever way it can. And I think when we started doing advocacy around the Uyghur issue, for example, we had to have very modest expectations, to say the least, about what could be achieved, you know, and certainly any states we spoke to were very skittish about raising anything to do with the Uyghurs. But I think that has changed over time. And I think there has been a reputational cost for the Chinese, and I do think that they're not happy about it. And we started to see kind of weird manifestations of that. Like, one was, I remember going to speak at the Human Rights Council in Geneva and walking through the hallway, and there was just this massive, you know, line of tables with banners and a whole bunch of young, attractive male and female Chinese diplomats who all spoke perfect French or English, who were all handing out booklets in English or French, or in Mandarin if you wanted them, on the situation in Xinjiang and the situation with the Uyghurs, trying to deal with what they obviously saw as a blemish and as an attack on them that was affecting their international reputation. And it's actually quite extraordinary to me, the shift that has taken place in awareness, at least, around the Uyghur issue. I think 3, 4, 5 years ago, no one had, not nobody, but very few people had much of an understanding about the Uyghur issue and what was going on there. I think that's really changed now. And, you know, I think NGOs, human rights organizations, the media, and others have played a role in all of that. The problem is that we haven't been able to turn those reputational costs into changed behavior on behalf of the Chinese state. But we'll keep going.
Thank you. Now we do have a few other questions. First, we have Ronan Lee, who wants to come with the question. What's your question, Ron?
Yeah, thanks so much, Simon, for your presentation and for your work. I'm very familiar with it and deeply appreciative of it. I've a practical question about the case at the ICJ. There's obviously been a coup. Who now has standing on behalf of Myanmar? And the reason I ask is that 2 days ago, the parallel government, the National Unity Government, issued a statement that seemed to indicate that they intended to continue the Aung San Suu Kyi approach before that body. It was an ambiguous statement, but I think it's an important question to clarify. So if you know, I'd be delighted to hear. And what does the coup now mean for that case?
Yeah, no. First of all, I'm sure many people watching this will be aware, but if they're not, they should go out and get a copy of Ronan's book on Myanmar, because I think it's a great book on the situation. Let me just say, that question of standing is going to have to be settled, but it is contested at the moment, and we have heard the name of an individual who will be named as representing the former government at the ICJ. I presume the new military junta will try and contest that in some way, and will try and make sure that they represent at the ICJ. But that battle is still to be played out. I will say that there is a bigger issue here, which is about how the NLD in the past, Aung San Suu Kyi and others viewed the whole issue of the Rohingya. And I think there has been the beginnings of a major rethink about that. I mean, you know, just even me myself, after the coup happened, I couldn't tell you how many messages I got from people inside Myanmar, either via social media or people email me directly as well, just saying, hey, can you, you know, we were wrong about the Rohingya, or can you please tell Rohingya people that we're sorry, I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure, etc., etc. And at the level of formal politics, I'm not sure how much of this that I can talk about, but for example, our staff have been in contact with the National Unity Government people, specifically on the issue of the Rohingya, human rights, and the case at the ICJ. And all I can probably say at this stage is that the signs at the moment are certainly positive, but that we all need to keep pressure up on them to kind of break from the failed politics of which were about essentially either ignoring the Rohingya issue or actually contributing to it further through discrimination and exclusion.
Thank you very much for that. I hope you have time for this, Dr. Adams. We have 3 other questions from the audience, if you don't mind. First, we come to Tom, and then I'll go to Vasilka, and then Adrian. We'll take these questions in one round, if that's okay. Tom, what's your question?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Adams, for a very interesting and inspiring presentation. I actually have a question about some of the other norms that are, you know, seem to be very much connected to R2P, but also have maybe a different status, such as the protection of civilians, the anti-impunity norm on which the ICC is built. And I was basically wondering what your thoughts are about connecting all of these norms into a larger enterprise, let's say, because of their shared foundations, especially in the light of recent research that shows that the controversy surrounding R2P and then attempts to connect R2P to, for example, the protection of civilians actually makes the whole enterprise more controversial, and also carries over the controversy surrounding R2P to norms like protection of civilians. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on those connections. Thank you very much.
And Vasilka, would you like to come in with your question?
Thank you. And thank you, Simon, for your very rich, important and inspiring contribution. And I'm so happy to have you with us throughout this conference series. And I hope this will remain so also for our future editions. Now, I want to ask you something about what do you think about the fact that the Human Rights Committee, you know, the treaty-based body established on the basis of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has included in its general comment number 36 that interprets Article 6, the right to life, in paragraph 70, and I quote, that at the same time, all states are reminded of their responsibility as members of the international community to protect lives and to oppose widespread and systematic attacks on the right to life, including, and then mentions genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. And the reason I'm asking this is because, as you know, the Human Rights Committee, as well as other treaty-based bodies, conduct these periodic reviews of the state parties' compliance with their obligations deriving from the legally binding treaty. And in this exercise, the committee members regularly also engage with representatives of civil society organizations in order to prepare for the constructive dialogue to be conducted with the relevant state party. And of course, recognizing that your resources are already under enormous pressure because of lack of scarcity of the relevant situations to deal with. But have you considered engaging with, for example, the Human Rights Committee or perhaps another treaty-based body in this preparation for the dialogues with states? Because at the end of the day, I mean, this is the body that calls upon the states parties to comply with their legal obligations. And as I mentioned, the Human Rights Committee has explicitly referred to responsibility to protect in its authoritative document, the General Comment number 36. So although China is not a state party to this international covenant, but there are currently 173 state parties, including all the remaining 4 permanent members of the Security Council, which also exercise jurisdiction in areas where mass atrocities are being committed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Adrian, your question.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon, for an insightful and honest assessment of the responsibility to protect. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Since the conference is in the memory of Ed Luck, and you spoke about his 3 contributions at the outset, I wanted to come back to this idea of individual responsibility. And you also mentioned like students as a target audience for this talk. And every year I have 90 students. Jason Ralph is actually teaching them this year. But 90 students, and they see the paralysis of the Security Council, and they're understandably frustrated, and they say, what can we do as individuals to help further the responsibility to protect? So I just wondered if you had any thoughts, since the conference was dedicated to Ed Luck, on how individuals can help fulfill the R2P, maybe in specific reference to Myanmar. And I hope Patrick doesn't mind me abusing my position. It's nothing actually to do with me, but there is a round table on remembering Ed Luck with Tom Wees, Michael Doyle, and others involved. And I'll put that in the chat because that came over my desk today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Adrian. You beat me to it. So thank you for mentioning that.
Wow, I get all the easy questions, huh? Let me start with Tom's question, I guess. Yeah, I think there's a connective tissue between all human rights and humanitarian norms. And I don't think that you can separate them out. They all have a kind of dynamic relationship to one another. I mean, we hosted Fatou Bensouda, the ICC chief prosecutor, recently, and she said this a few times, but she said it again. She said the ICC is the legal arm of the responsibility to protect. And it's an interesting formulation, but I think it speaks to something about the interconnectedness. With regards to POC, protection of civilians, I don't think it's true that, I think if you actually look at most of the mandates that have been adopted on the protection of civilians in the UN Security Council, whether that be in Central African Republic or DRC or elsewhere, there are pretty strong responsibility to protect mentions and mentions of mass atrocity crimes, etc., etc. So it hasn't been a problem in my experience. I think the bigger issue is that the issue that we do face is that there is no magical formulation, and there is no way to keep any of these things pristine and separated from one another. Well, my impression is that all human rights and humanitarian norms are uncontroversial until the second you start trying to implement them. The second you try to implement them in the real world, that's when we hit the trouble with states who don't like this or don't like that. And in my experience, that's no different if it's protection of civilians in Central African Republic or it's LGBT plus rights in Uganda whether it's the International Criminal Court and other forms of international justice and so on and so forth. So, my own approach has been that all of our human rights and humanitarian norms rise and fall together. And so I feel kind of compelled to push for all of them to advance and to defend what we have, because I think they are the safeguards of humanity. In relation to Vasilka's question, I'm not 100% I got it, but there was a little bit of a sound problem. But, I think there's, and this maybe goes back to what I just said in relation to Tom's question as well. I don't think there's a single norm in the world or idea in the world that couldn't be misused or distorted for partisan reasons if people wanted to. That's been true of the entire history of human rights, and will continue to be true. In terms of us as an organization, we do respond to Geneva Treaty bodies on an ad hoc basis, though. We do respond to the UPR on a more systematic basis. We have, of course, a small office in Geneva, and we are constantly looking for when something like what you talked about, Vasilka, pops up. We're kind of trying to figure out how we should respond, how we talk to states about how they should respond, and making sure that we don't miss things like this. And despite our scarce resources, we'll continue to do so. Finally, in relation to Adrian's comment, and it's nice to see the faces of old friends here on the screen today as well. Yeah, I think that was one of Ed and Dana's real contributions, was that Ed was very focused on that himself, the importance of individuals. And certainly I try to do this myself, and I think Ed was a lot like this as well, is that he would talk wherever people would invite him. He would talk to university students, he would talk to, and I sometimes get asked by people why I will do a speech for high school students in the west of England, which I did recently, or why I'm talking to university students in Thailand, and this one in Latin America, and these people in Kenya or something. And I'm always trying to talk around the particular forum that I'm in and try and speak to the individuals who are out there, because I really do believe, and I think it's something that you believe as well, Adrian, that I do believe that as individuals and collective action that can change the world. And the common question I get asked is not just the what can I do question, but it's the like, how do you get out of bed in the morning and keep doing your job when it's a job which is predicated upon repeated failure? You're going to constantly be pushing against failure. And when you get those successes, you hold on to them and you shout loudly about them. But it's tough. And and I always point to the people that I get to work with around the world who really do truly inspire me. Human rights defenders in places like Syria, and people who run their own little monitoring, one-person human rights monitoring organization in Benai in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, people who we're still in contact with in Myanmar, even though the internet is cut, and who are still trying to document and talk about the situation in their country. Those are the people who truly, truly, truly do inspire me. And I guess the other thing I always say, and maybe this is a long-winded answer to your question, Adrian, is that I'm an old has-been now of 53 years of age, and but I a long time ago was a member of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. I never thought I would see the change that happened in South Africa. Certainly, when I joined the movement, that was not on the cards as being part of the something that would eventuate. But I think that is a monumental change that did take place through activism, through people getting involved in their local communities. And so the point that I always underline in relation to this is not just that, you know, I was talking about Myanmar today, so that every person who heard this needs to go out and become a Myanmar activist. I just think the one thing that protects our human rights at home and helps advance human rights abroad is the more active and engaged and involved people are in building civil society, in building human rights organizations wherever they live. So yeah, that's how I think we uphold our responsibility to protect. We all need to be active members of civil society.
Excellent. I think a lot of us would certainly agree with that. Thank you very much. At this point, I would like to thank Dr. Simon Adams for joining us for our keynote today. Thank you for taking our questions, and thank you for putting up with our slight hitch in the middle of that session there. Thank you everyone for joining us on GatherTown and on YouTube and in the room. At this point in time, what I'm going to do is close down the live stream for today. Those of you in the Collaborate room, feel free to stay on, switch on gallery mode, switch on your cameras and your microphones and discuss and network for as long as you're able to join us. But for now, thank you very much, everyone. Tomorrow we will resume at 9 a.m. UK time. That's 9 a.m. BST or 10 a.m. Central European time, where we will start with panel 6 on addressing the warnings of atrocity crimes and continue throughout the day with plenty of packed sessions, including our second keynote panel with the United Nations Secretary General Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide and the United Nations Secretary General Special Advisor on the Responsibility to Protect as well. Also followed by a publishing workshop with some publishers and editors for early career researchers who are seeking to publish on the Responsibility to Protect, where you can discuss some tips, challenges, and advice for academic publishing. Thank you very much. I will end the live stream there. Those of you in the room, please feel free to remain behind and ask any further questions that perhaps Dr. Adams will take from you before he wants to escape. Thank you very much.
My only request is that we end this Dr. Adams stuff. I mean, really, my mom calls me that when she's trying to impress all other pensioners, you know.